So the Stinger Hawk that's the name of our platform. It's actually one of our best-selling spectacles in the military and tactical markets. That's a single lens with a wraparound. It has a really high level of protection in terms of the amount of your face it's going to protect. And also, if you have a laser beam coming really from the side, you're going to get that full protection. So think of the Stinger Hawk spectacle as really the maximum amount of protection that you can get.
You just heard Kelly Krajewski, who works for Revision Military, talking about the new eyewear for pilots that protects against laser strikes. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, where we talk general aviation with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Truscott. Last week in episode 222, we talked with George Brawley about his new G100UL unleaded fuel. So if you didn't hear that episode, you may want to check it out at aviationnewstalk.com/222. This week after the news, we'll talk with Rob Mark about the scope of aircraft laser strikes and what the FAA and others are doing about the problem. Later, we'll talk with Kelly Krajewski about a new solution, protective eyewear for pilots, for dealing with the laser strike problem. Later, we'll also have some of your emails and comments. Thanks so much for sending those, as I love hearing from you and sharing them on the show. This, of course, is a listener-supported show, and we're still ad-free. So please sign up and become a member and support the show financially at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. And when you do, I'll read your name on the show. This week in the news, the world's largest aircraft has apparently been destroyed. A pilot charged with murder is suing to get his job back. And finally, we have the story of a rock and roll musician who accidentally played an unreleased song over an ATC frequency. All this and more, and the news starts now. From flyingmag.com, new video claims to confirm AN-225 destruction. New video purportedly documenting the smoldering debris of the iconic Antonov An-225 Marianne emerged last week, days after Ukrainian officials confirmed the world's largest cargo airplane was destroyed during fighting with Russian forces. Confirmation the An-225 was destroyed in battles at the Gostomel airport north of Kyiv, along with a lot of military equipment, UK-based Elent News said in a social media post to the video. The video clip alone is not enough to determine the massive twin-tail six-engine jet's condition, according to Ukraine-based Antonov. In a tweet from the Antonov company, they said, "Currently, until the An-225 has been inspected by experts, we cannot report on the technical condition of the aircraft. Please wait for the official announcements about the condition of the aircraft." Sunday, officials in Ukraine confirmed the aircraft's damage. The biggest plane in the world, Marianne, which means the dream, was destroyed by Russian occupants on an airfield near Kyiv, according to Ukraine social media. "We will rebuild the plane. We will fulfill our dreams of a strong, free, and democratic Ukraine." Questions regarding the fate of the Soviet-era strategic airlift cargo airplane with a 290-foot wingspan immediately began circulating last week following fighting at Antonov International, a cargo airport owned by aircraft manufacturer Antonov. The jet and the historic Antonov Design Bureau that designed and built it in the 1980s has come to symbolize Ukrainian industrial prowess. During the 20th century, Antonov built several important airplanes for the Soviet Union, including a smaller four-engine cargo jet dubbed the AN-124 and the massive four-turboprop AN-22 heavy military transport. The AN-225 was so big it was given the name Marianne because initially its mission was to transport the Soviet space shuttle Overrun. In fact, Marianne, with Overrun mounted on top, was one of the stars of the 1989 Paris Air Show. When the Soviet Union ended its shuttle program, the AN-225 found a new mission, flying massive equipment such as steam generators and power transformers around the world. From avweb.com, U.S. blocks Russian aircraft from all domestic airspace. The U.S. Department of Transportation and the FAA have issued orders blocking Russian aircraft and airlines from entering and using U.S. domestic airspace. The ban has been issued via a NOTAM to Air Missions, or NOTAM, and regulatory orders which will suspend operations of, quote, all aircraft owned, certified, operated, registered, chartered, leased, or controlled by, for, or for the benefit of a person who is a citizen of Russia. The move comes in response to Russia's ongoing invasion of Ukraine. As previously reported by AvWeb, Canada and many European nations closed their airspace to Russian aircraft over the weekend. As of Monday, Russia had banned aircraft from 36 countries, including the UK, Canada, and all 27 European Union member states from its airspace. U.S. Transportation Secretary Pete Buttigieg said the U.S. stands with our allies and partners across the world in responding to Putin's unprovoked aggression against the people of Ukraine. And in a related story from Bloomberg.com, Boeing gets caught in a bind as the U.S. bans giant Russian cargo jets. Boeing Company is caught in a bind after the U.S. barred Russian airlines from its skies following the invasion of Ukraine. The move could affect Boeing's main wide-body plant in Everett, Washington, near Seattle, where giant Antonov An-225 cargo planes, operated by Russia's Volga-Dnepr group, are used to fly structures from other plants. The U.S. DOT had authorized Volga-Dnepr to operate at least 27 flights since early 2021, many of them for Boeing, according to regulatory filings. In the latest request on February 24th, the cargo carrier sought permission for 6 flights by April 4th to haul 11-ton 767 wing boxes from a supplier in Florida. Volga-Dnepr's giant Antonov aircraft were the only option to, quote, perform the services in question within the set schedule, the latest filing said. Timely shipments were vital to avoid substantial delays to Boeing's production schedule, it said. Brian Clancy, managing director of Logistics Capital and Strategy, LLC, said, Boeing needs its equipment and components. The reality of it is that we're all codependent on each other's planes. The now banned flights from this longtime Boeing partner and customer are just one of the ripples through aviation from the sanctions placed on Russia after last week's invasion. Boeing also has halted much of the engineering work it does in Moscow and restricted employee access in Russia to sensitive data while it seeks U.S. export licenses. The only other civil An-124 operator, apart from Volga-Dnepr, is Antonov Airlines, which is based in Ukraine. The status of that fleet is uncertain, and the sole An-225, as we reported earlier, an even larger 6-engine variant, was reported as damaged beyond repair. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, JetBlue pilot removed from cockpit allegedly found to be 4 times over the alcohol limit. A JetBlue pilot was allegedly found to be over 4 times the legal limit as he prepared to fly an Airbus A320 full of passengers from Buffalo Niagara Airport on a scheduled service to Fort Lauderdale on Wednesday last week. The pilot, who has been identified as a 52-year-old JetBlue crew member, was removed from the cockpit shortly before takeoff and made to take a blood alcohol test. Officials claim his blood alcohol level was found to be 0.17. The legal limit is just 0.04. A spokesperson for JetBlue confirmed the incident, saying the pilot had been suspended and that an internal investigation had been opened alongside any pending criminal charges. Quote, the safety of JetBlue customers and crew members is our first priority. We adhere to all DOT rules and requirements concerning alcohol at all times and have a very strict zero-tolerance internal alcohol policy, the airline said. We are aware of the incident that occurred this morning in Buffalo and are cooperating fully with law enforcement. We are also conducting our own internal investigation. The crew member involved has been removed from his duties. JetBlue Flight 2465 was due to depart Buffalo at 6:15 a.m., but the aircraft was delayed by over 4 hours as the airline scrambled to find a replacement pilot. The flight eventually landed in Fort Lauderdale at just about 1 p.m. Under FAA rules, pilots must not consume alcohol within 8 hours of flight, and even then they must ensure that they haven't drunk so much alcohol from bottle to throttle that their blood alcohol concentration doesn't exceed 0.04. Law enforcement officials are only authorized to demand a blood alcohol test from crew members when they are investigating a suspected violation of the rules. Now, I've read elsewhere that there is a small amount of random alcohol testing that is done of airline pilots in the airports. And another source on this particular story said that the pilot involved admitted having 7 to 8 drinks the night before the flight. From FlyingMag.com, Aerobatics pilot Marianne Fox killed in runway overrun at St. Augustine. The NTSB and FAA are investigating the accident that took the life of aerobatic pilot competitor Marianne Fox on Wednesday. Fox and a long-term friend, International Aerobatic Club president Jim Bork, were flying in separate aircraft en route from Keystone Heights Airport to North Florida Regional Airport in St. Augustine. According to FlightAware, the pair were flying as a formation flight of 2, departing from Keystone Heights at about 4 p.m. The flight distance was 38 nautical miles. When the aircraft was about 7 miles west of St. Augustine, Burke contacted ATC to report that Fox's aircraft had developed engine trouble and was trailing smoke. According to liveetc.com, Fox declared an emergency moments later. Burke tried to help Fox during the approach, advising her to put the aircraft into a slip, because she was coming in too fast during the straight-in approach to KSGJ. Fox's aircraft went off the end of the runway, coming to rest upside down in a swamp. Fox was pulled from the wreckage alive but succumbed to her injuries a few hours later at a local hospital. According to the IAC, arrangements are being made for a funeral near her childhood home in Oregon. From avweb.com, CommutAir new hires now do even better with a fresh contract deal. The long-suffering lot of regional airline pilots just got a lot better as the ongoing pilot shortage has mandated another career upgrade for up-and-coming airline pilots. ALPA, the Airline Pilots Association, announced a new long-term contract with Cleveland-based CommutAir, a regional carrier 40% owned by United Airlines. With a fleet of more than 75 Embraer 145s, CommutAir operates around 1,500 weekly flights with hubs in Denver, Houston, and Virginia's Washington Dulles Airport. Under terms of the new contract, wages for new first officers increased 30% to $51 per hour, while new captains will earn $84 per hour, a 25% increase. There is a sign-on bonus program awarding up to $50,000 for direct entry captains, with longevity credit of as much as 50% for new hires who have Part 121 industry experience. CommutAir is also offering a commuting program that includes company-paid travel to and from pilots' chosen home location and a 50% match on 401k retirement contributions, up to 16%. Rick Huffling, CommutAir president and CEO, said, "As the industry recovers from the past 2 years of challenges, we believe we have a tremendous opportunity to see continued growth in our business. I want to thank the ALPA and CommutAir negotiating teams for their tireless dedication to arrive at a new contract that positions the company and its pilots on solid footing for years to come." From AINonline.com, NetJets agrees to buy and operate 150 Lilium eVTOLs. Fractional aircraft provider NetJets plans to add 150 Lilium eVTOLs to its fleet, Lilium revealed to investors this week. NetJets has secured purchase rights for Lilium's 6-passenger model, which could be operated in both the U.S. and Europe. In the February 28th statement to investors, German-based Lilium said NetJets would operate the aircraft and might also become a flight operations partner for Lilium's planned service network in Florida and other locations. According to Lilium, NetJets could potentially run Lilium's service in Florida under its existing Part 135 Air Operator Certificate. In November 2020, Lilium announced plans to provide eVTOL connections between larger cities in Central and South Florida, built around a network of vertiports at locations such as Lake Nona community near Orlando. Lilium is aiming to certify its eVTOL and start commercial services in 2024. It has not said when it will start flight testing a pre-production prototype, but has told investors it will release design data to its supply chain during the second quarter. The company is still flight testing a 5-seat technology demonstrator of its ducted fan fixed-wing model. From GeneralAviationNews.com, a pilot forgets to lower landing gear during checkride. The pilot was receiving a checkride from a designated pilot examiner for his single-pilot rating in a turbine aircraft. After a series of maneuvers, emergencies, and landings, the examiner asked the pilot to complete a no-flap landing in the Cessna 510 to the airport in Daytona Beach, Florida. The pilot reported he performed the before-landing checklist with 0 flaps and believed he put the gear down. During touchdown, he felt a thump and thought the airplane had a blown tire. However, when he saw the landing gear handle, it was in the up position. He told investigators that the landing gear warning horn did not sound because the flaps were in the up position. The examiner confirmed the landing gear handle was in the up position. The landing gear was lowered and locked into place without issue after the airplane was lifted from the runway. There were no mechanical functions or failures with the airplane that could have precluded normal operation. Probable cause? The pilot's failure to lower the landing gear before landing. Contributing to the accident was the examiner's failure to check the landing gear was extended. From paddleyourown.canoe.com, pilot accused of murdering elderly couple sues Ex-Airline for unfair dismissal. Now, this is the first time we're talking about a murder story involving a pilot, though I've seen a number of these in the past and have chosen not to report on them since they had nothing to do with aviation per se. But this one has a very odd twist. An airline pilot accused of murdering an elderly couple is suing his former employer for unfair dismissal after bosses sacked him when he was remanded into custody. Greg Glynn, 55, of Caroline Springs to the west of Melbourne, Australia, stands accused of murdering elderly campers Carol Clay and Russell Hill. The couple went missing during a camping trip in March 2020. Lynn was arrested in December and has not been found guilty of any crime ahead of his trial later this year. Bosses at Jetstar, however, sacked him in January because his present circumstances prevent him from working as a captain on the airline's A320 fleet. The Transport Workers Union, TWU, has taken up Lynn's case and has accused Jetstar of denying him procedural fairness. In a letter to the airline, the union said Lynn's dismissal was harsh, unjust, and unreasonable. The two sides were unable to come to an agreement, so the case has now been referred to the Fair Work Commission. Lynn argues that he can't be expected to attend work because he is remanded in custody pending his trial, but he has not been found guilty of any crime or workplace misconduct. The union is representing him in his unfair dismissal claim only and is not involved in the criminal case. And also from Down Under, dramatic scenes from the northern NSW floods captured from the sky. Now, thanks to listener Colin Mulligan, who called this story to my attention. New South Wales is in the firing line with the Northern Rivers region, and in particular, Lismore, experiencing some of the worst flooding it has ever seen. Dramatic rescues were captured by a current affairs camera from a helicopter flying above flood-affected areas. Lismore was the first place in the state to be flooded after a levee that was built to protect the town gave way. A day later, while some of the water had dropped off slightly, there were still people moving about, a lot of them in canoes. Lismore Airport was totally flooded, and some of the smaller aircraft appeared as if they'd been thrown around like toys. And Colin sent me a photo from his Instagram account that shows about 8 or 9 GA aircraft that are nearly fully submerged at that airport. And finally from metalcastle.net, our heavy metal story. And the title is Bruce Dickinson recalls accidentally playing unreleased Iron Maiden album over ATC. Bruce Dickinson, lead singer of the heavy metal group Iron Maiden, recently disclosed the story of how an unreleased Iron Maiden song ended up getting broadcast from an aircraft onto an ATC frequency. Iron Maiden, who is considered as one of the pioneers of British heavy metal, left their mark in the 1980s. The band has sold almost 20 million copies, with the album The Number of the Beast alone. Dance of Death, the group's 13th studio album, was released in September of 2003 and peaked at number 2 on the UK albums charts. But one of the album's songs was accidentally broadcast over an ATC frequency before it was released. Bruce Dickinson recently revealed the details. He said, "Once we were coming back empty from somewhere down in Egypt or somewhere, but it was an empty airplane," he said. "So the cockpit's doors open, the cabin crew are all in the back, and they're all chilled out or asleep or doing whatever, and we're flying over Italy and the crew's autopilot's on, thumb in the bum, mind in neutral, you know. And my first officer was a big rock fan, a big AC/DC and airborne fan, right? So whenever we're on a trip, he'd brought his boombox with him, and he said, 'Hey boss, listen, do you mind? We're in cruise if I listen to music.' I went, 'Of course it's not strictly company procedure, but yeah, come on.' So on goes AC/DC, a bit of airborne, and we're grooving away. And I said, 'You know what? I happen to have the just mixed copy of the new Iron Maiden album on me, which nobody in the world has heard apart from the band and the management. Do you want to hear it?' He's like, 'Yeah, cool.' I said, 'Yeah.' So out comes the blank CD, put it in the CD player, and as it was then, put the boombox on the pedestal and started playing it. And I shout back to the girls and boys, 'Anyone want to hear the new Maiden album?' They went, 'Yeah.' So I got the hand microphone and put it up against the speaker, and wherever in the album, probably Rainmaker or something, it's blasting all throughout the cabin, and we're all having a good time. And it's been about 4 minutes or so, and I'm thinking, I haven't heard much on the radio recently, so I put the hand mic down and think, oh crap. And then I finally get on to Rome, and all I can hear is this bloke going, 'Who is transmitting? Who is transmitting the music? What airline are you? Who are you? Own up.' And the great thing was, he couldn't have a clue who it was because the album wasn't released yet. Well, that's the news for this week. Coming up next, Rob Mark talks about the scope of aircraft laser strikes and what the FAA is doing about it. And then Kelly Krajewski of Revision Military talks about their new laser eyewear protection for pilots, and she's offering a special discount code just for Aviation News Talk listeners. And then more of your feedback and questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And now let me tell you a little about my friend Rob Mark. He's worked as an air traffic controller and as an airline pilot, corporate pilot, and CFI. He publishes the Jetwine blog at jetwine.com, and you can also find his writing in the pages of Business and Commercial Aviation magazine, which is part of the Aviation Week group. And now here's our conversation about lasers with Rob Mark. Well, Rob, welcome to the show. Great to see you again. How are you doing?
Hey, thanks very much, Max. Thanks for inviting me. I'm doing fine. How are you?
I'm awesome. Thank you. Hey, you wrote an excellent article recently on aircraft laser strikes that appeared in Business and Commercial Aviation magazine, which is part of the Aviation Week group. Scale the problem for us. Just how big a deal is laser strikes?
Probably a lot larger than most people think. Last year, which was 2021, the FAA recorded just shy of 10,000 laser pointer incidents reported from pilots. I think I did the math, and it works out to be about 27 or 28 a day. And that was up 40% from the year before, 2020, when the pandemic started. And it was at just over 6,800.
Boy, so the problem just keeps getting worse and worse. What did you find out about injuries? Because we always hear about laser strikes, but we never hear about whether pilots are actually getting injured by them.
Over a 10-year period, we found that the FAA reported 244 injuries. So not a great many. Of course, now it didn't qualify them as to serious or minor or anything like that. But of course, what the 10,000 does represent is potential. And forget that there were only 244 over 10 years that got hurt. There were 10,000 opportunities for people to become seriously injured. And that's a lot of opportunities.
Yeah, I was thinking of all the things that you might get injured. The eyes are not something you want to mess with. I mean, I just don't know how well they recover from these kinds of injuries. So, yeah, I certainly really do not want to get injured in that way.
Well, no, and a number of the people that we spoke to said we were lucky they illuminated the cockpit, but the guy in the left seat or the lady in the left seat was quick enough to turn their head the other way. And, of course, there was another pilot on the other side that, managed to make sure that the aircraft commander didn't lose control of the airplane. Helicopters, whole different story, because those are the ones that are getting hit the most, and they're down low to the ground. And so the intensity of the laser is probably much greater. And of course, it's the flexibility of the helicopter that allows them to catch these guys, because that's the big problem that we've had with aircraft, is that when a jet goes over at 10,000 feet and gets hit with a laser, the crew can kind of pinpoint where they were when it happened, and they'll normally report it to ATC. But the chances of that air traffic facility coordinating with local law enforcement to try to go out and find somebody it's probably almost nil.
Yeah, I think the helicopter crews are probably bearing the brunt of this. Not only are they closer to the ground, which means the laser is going to be more intense, but I think those aircraft often have far more bubble, if you will, far more glass. So when they get hit, that light is just going to scatter everywhere and make that entire cockpit exceedingly bright.
Well, it does. And if I didn't mention it before, there's a reason that the green lasers are so prominent these days. Anybody can buy a powerful green laser on Amazon for $29.95. But the eye is much more sensitive to the wavelength of the green laser than it is of the red. So the greens appear much more powerful. But either way, these things are way too easy to get hold of.
So you did some investigating, a few calls with the FAA. What did you find out about what they're doing?
Well, the FAA, of course, has the opportunity or the ability to fine people, depending on the seriousness of it, 11 grand per incident, or as much as 30,800 for multiple incidents. But over the last year, they've recorded about $120,000 in fines. Well, do the math. What does that tell you? Maybe 10, 11, 12. I mean, that's less than a quarter of 1% of the number of incidents that have actually occurred. So if they are doing anything other than a public education campaign, which of course they are, I was not able to uncover that.
Yeah, I think for years I thought that the problem would get solved by public education. that as the FAA, fined people, as local courts threw people in jail, as television news reported these things, that people would get the idea, oh, I really shouldn't shine a laser at an aircraft. And yet the problem just keeps getting worse. Could you find anybody in the FAA that's actually responsible for figuring out how to deal with this problem?
No, I certainly was not. And again, I think that might be because there is nobody, there is no particular strategy in place, at least that any of us on the outside know about. Again, it's very difficult to find an agency expert on much of anything these days. But the agency has a history for decades, that the only time the FAA does anything about a real issue that we as pilots see is when there's an accident. And there hasn't been an accident yet, but we're already on track for 2022 to exceed the number of laser strike incidents that we had last year when we just almost topped 10,000. Again, if you were a gambling man, what would it take before you'd say they're going to catch up with somebody one of these days? Where is it going to be? When? Who knows?
Yeah, and that's exactly where I wanted to go with you was accidents. I think that if and when we do have an accident, the FAA is going to be all over this, and people are going to be pointing to all kinds of things that could have been done. Kind of reminds me, years ago, my mother said that when there was an accident on the street corner, that's when they would finally install the traffic light after someone got killed. And I think we're looking at the same thing here with this particular problem. Another thing is, I was wondering, do you think it's possible that maybe we've already had a laser accident and there was just no evidence afterwards? Because how would you know if a helicopter came down because it was hit by a laser?
Well, we do have a great many loss of control accidents. Of course, the one thing that we do know is that you need really good weather in order to point a laser at an airplane, because if it's 602, unless the pointer is right near the airport, pilot's never going to see it. So these tend to happen on really clear nights. And I don't know. That's an interesting question. I did not try to correlate any loss of control accidents in that kind of weather with anything like this.
Yeah, just occurred to me that unless someone happened to see the laser who was not in the aircraft, we might never know, because there would be zero evidence, I think, of any impact on the aircraft from the laser. So these things could go by totally unnoticed.
And that's why, as I said before, that the helicopters are so valuable, because the pilots can kick the aircraft around and head back to where they were, and they know the pointer's coming at some point, and then they get on the two-way radio and they call in some ground units, and they find these people on the ground pretty easily, actually. There's one that I found during my research. A fellow was sitting in the back end of his pickup truck, just shining his laser up at anything that went by, and his first target just happened to be a local police helicopter, and that was actually the last time that he did that.
Yeah. So you found a website called laserpointersafety.com run by Patrick Murphy. And what did he say about why people laze aircraft? Because we could speculate all day about this, I suppose, but and it seems to you and I like an absurdly dumb thing to do. But what did he have to say about it?
Well, Patrick minced no words to me about his feeling on people that are shining lasers at aircraft. And he told me that the people that do this fall into one of two categories. One is people who simply don't understand the danger of their lasers, and that certainly can happen. I haven't purchased one of these from Amazon, but I hope it says something in the box like, don't point this at somebody's eyes. So there are people that don't understand the power of their lasers, and then there are those who just don't care. It's the ones that don't care that are really vicious, because they just keep targeting one flying machine after another. But one thing I did wonder is that, the kind of people that don't care, you'd say, well, gee, maybe that was somebody that was out of work during the pandemic or had to stay inside. And I would have thought that people on the interstate would have been reporting these kind of people shining lasers at 18-wheelers and that sort of thing, because they're a much easier target. They're much more frequent, but I wasn't able to uncover anything about that either. Of course, I don't want to be giving anybody any ideas, but that was just off the top of my head.
Yeah, it is interesting. We don't hear about lasers getting misused in any other way, but maybe that's just because we're pilots and we're focused in on the aviation uses. Well, Rob, any final thoughts about lasers and laser strikes as we wrap this up?
Well, the FAA did give me some information about what they thought was the reason for all of these incidents or this increase. The availability of inexpensive lasers, the abundance of lasers in stores and online, the number of people giving gifts that are lasers to other people, the stronger power levels now of lasers. And you and I talked about that before we recorded, that the green lasers, like the red ones, could be used on a PowerPoint presentation when you point something out, or as we also saw, some astronomers use the green ones to point out to students where a particular star is. But other than that, please tell me, someone, what the point, what the value, what the purpose is of a powerful green laser, because I simply do not know.
And what's the process for reporting these incidents? If a pilot's listening and they've been hit by a laser, what do they do?
Well, many of the pilots report them directly to ATC and assume that they're covered. And they may not be. There's a link up on the FAA.gov website that says report a laser strike. And pilots are encouraged to fill that out. It doesn't take long, 20, 30 seconds, and the FAA has a report. In fact, that's where many of these are coming from, because as a former controller, I can only tell you that if a facility is busy and they get a laser pointer incident from someone while a jet is on approach 18 miles northeast of the airport, I may not have time to follow up and make sure that the agency itself got this information. And it's valuable, but again, I still just keep thinking of the odds that one of these days it's going to bring somebody down. And then, as you said, all hell's going to break loose.
Yep, indeed. Well, Rob, thanks so much for your great work on this incredibly important topic. Where do people go to find more of your work?
They can find me at jetwine.com, of course, but also in the pages of Business and Commercial Aviation, which is part of the Aviation Week group.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Always fun to talk with you.
Hey, you too. Thanks, Max.
And my thanks to Rob for joining us today. You can read more of his work in Business and Commercial Aviation magazine, which is part of the Aviation Week group, and it is Jetwine blog at jetwine.com. Now, by the way, I went out to laserpointersafety.com, and it turns out they have a separate page for non-aviation incidents that lists a total of 317 incidents, most of which are about people pointing lasers at cars or police officers. So I guess it's not just aviation that suffers from this problem. And now let me tell you a little bit about Kelly Krajewski. She's the Director of Brand Marketing and Government Affairs at Revision Military, which has just released laser protection eyewear for pilots. She's worked for the company for over 14 years in a variety of marketing positions. And now here's our conversation with Kelly Krajewski. Kelly, welcome to the show. Great to have you here today.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Well, you're involved in an area that's of great interest to me, which is laser strikes against pilots. Now, unfortunately, the trends don't seem to be going our way. Tell us what you can about what's happened in recent years.
Yeah, so luckily the FAA does track laser strikes and does report openly each year. So each February they publish the number of laser strikes that were reported in the previous year. And just this February announced that we have a 40% increase in laser strikes in 2021 over 2020. And even though we had less planes in the sky in 2020 due to the pandemic, we still have seen an increase every single year for at least the last 15 years of laser strikes against pilots.
Yeah, that's really unfortunate because it certainly is dangerous. One of the things I read on your website kind of surprised me, and I'd never thought about it. You said that strikes might actually be underreported by pilots. Why might that be the case?
So this is just something that pilots have shared with us in conversations about the issue, that if they see a laser against them, If they don't feel like if it's affected them in any way, or it maybe wasn't a super bright laser strike, they might not report it, because currently as it is, when they report, they often can be pulled for medical evaluation to ensure that there was no damage done to their eyes in the laser strike. So unfortunately, part of them becoming a lot more common is a lot more complacency with them, and unfortunately, perhaps less reporting. But that's just what we've heard from pilots.
Well, either way, it's a huge problem. Tell us about two different strategies for dealing with laser strikes, deterrence versus defense.
Yeah, Max, so there is a lot talked about in terms of deterrence. So every time you see a news article about laser strikes, you're seeing information about the fines associated with this, which they keep growing and it's not cheap. And there's also a lot of efforts to finding and prosecuting offenders. So I get news alerts every single day of individuals who are being charged for the crimes. And interestingly enough, it's actually not that difficult to find the individuals who are on the ground shining a laser. So there's a lot of effort put to prosecuting those folks in an effort to deter laser strikes. Unfortunately, that doesn't really seem to be helping. And another element of it is nothing's changed on the access to these lasers for everyday civilians. You can go on Amazon and you can buy any of these lasers for $15-16 and come to your house for a variety of uses. So it's certainly something that is widely accessible to a lot of individuals. And unfortunately, it's usually not people who are trying to do something nefarious. They are just trying to see what happens when they shine a laser to a plane and not really understanding the implications and the danger. You know, Revision as a company, we are a protective eyewear company primarily for military and tactical end users. So we've been around for about 20 years, and we make protective eyewear for men and women in uniform. So we're very used to there being threats to individuals, but protection as a preventative measure, right? Protective eyewear to protect in a combat situation against eye injuries. And so we really have applied the same thinking in terms of defense, that if a pilot has a pair of protective eyewear beside them that really can protect them from the laser, that is a better way to protect the pilot and passengers, if it's a passenger aircraft, than trying to prosecute the folks with lasers on the ground.
Yeah, I came to the same conclusion about a year ago. For the past 5 years in this show, we've reported laser strikes, and there's so many of them that we only report them occasionally. And I thought that eventually, by publicizing the prison sentences and the fines, that eventually this problem would go away. Clearly, it's just getting worse. So I agree. I don't think deterrence is working. Pilots, I think, are going to have to shift to a defense strategy and start using eye protection. Tell us about traditional laser eye protection that's been available up until now and why that's less effective for pilots.
You know, one of our advantages is we have been making custom laser eyewear for over a decade for those military and tactical end users. So we've taken those solutions into a cockpit to see if they work well in that environment. And we have had some solutions that have performed decently well, but the challenge is, you know, as you know, there's a lot of lights in a cockpit, and color recognition is critical. And you cannot put something on your face that is going to change the color of the indicators in your cockpit. So in our partnership with the Air Force Research Lab, we really determined that we have to create something that is for this specific environment to ensure that true color recognition. Otherwise, one, you're not going to have pilots who feel comfortable wearing it, and then therefore they're just not going to be protected in that time. So really dialing in that color recognition is the reason why you would want eye protection that's designed for the cockpit versus just a standard eye protection.
Tell us about that research with the Air Force Research Lab. What kinds of things were they investigating, and what did they find out?
So we've been working with them for many years on advanced research and development projects, and a lot of their work is really, as you can imagine, tailored for the Air Force and military. It often doesn't spin out into technologies and solutions for a civilian market. But this was one where really in response to these increasing laser strikes for aviation, and I believe the AFRL had been having conversations with the FAA as well about the issue and really looking to find a solution that could work. And so they chose us as one of the partners because AFRL is a research institution, but they have to have a partner who's able to commercialize it, someone who's actually able to develop the solution and manufacture it at scale. And that's where we come in because that's where our capabilities are as well. So it was really key for them to drive the development of the actual dye solution that's used to block the laser lights and also optimize that color recognition. So they really drove the development of that formulation. We helped tweak some of that and then also be able to manufacture the solution.
I understand the lens formulation is called CALI. What does that stand for and what does it mean?
So it stands for Commercial Aviation Low Intensity, and that was a name that AFRL came up with for the name of this product to indicate really what its use is.
Okay.
And our specific formulation is the CALI C version, which is just slightly different than what was originally developed for AFRL.
And what kind of lasers does this protect against?
So this is going to protect against the primary lasers that an individual would see. So really it's mainly the green and violet blue that we are protecting against with this lens.
Okay. Now you have a chart that talks about visual effects and hazard distances of a 5 milliwatt green handheld laser. This is something I hadn't really thought about, but apparently the effect on pilots differs depending upon the altitude. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So the way that the laser works is the closer you are to it, the more protection you get. And the further away, the more that laser light disperses and the level of protection required at the altitude starts to diminish. Why that matters for this solution is that's really where we're able to tailor the solution and the color recognition and the amount of light transmission that you get in this product for a cockpit environment, because you don't need the intense level of protection required if you're on the ground and you might be experiencing a laser at like 50 to 100 feet, which does require a different solution.
I see. And so in essence, helicopters sounds like are a greater threat because they tend to fly lower, maybe at 500 feet versus airplanes, which are typically well above 1,000 feet most of the time.
Exactly. And really for fixed wing aircraft, the threat really is only on takeoff and landing. And really once they get to that higher altitude, there is no laser threat. But as you're right, helicopters, we're seeing a tremendous amount. The reports of certainly law enforcement helicopters, but then also there's been a few published incidents lately of AirMed helicopters, that are transporting critical care patients are being lased, which is a tremendous threat because when a laser hits an aircraft, it can often fill the cockpit with that colored light. Traditionally, it's more of the green light, which proves to be a tremendous distraction in a moment where you absolutely do not want to be distracted, a little bit of disorientation as well. And so that is absolutely a big threat for helicopters.
Well, and you've got two different versions of the new eyewear that you're announcing. What's different about the needs in helicopters that you would have different eyewear for helicopter pilots versus for airplane pilots?
So really two primary things. The SF2, which was developed really for more of the airplane cockpits, doesn't have an anti-fog coating on the inside because normally you're in a more climate-controlled environment. The other thing is that allowed us to have more of an aviator-style frame, which what we have really found is the style is very important to the pilots as well. So it really makes sense to have that kind of solution for an airplane cockpit. And the helicopter, you're going to have potentially more of a fogging issue, right? You're going to have more of a higher temperature. So you need that anti-fog performance on the lens. The other thing that the Stinger Hawk frame offers is the ballistic protection, which we're known for. Now, there's not a tremendous amount of ballistic threats in a helicopter cockpit, but they're certainly a bit higher than it would be in an airplane cockpit. So just that additional protection is nice to have as well.
Okay, you mentioned Stinger. Go ahead and tell us about the two names of the two different products and how they differ physically when you look at the products.
Sure. So the Stinger Hawk that's the name of our platform. It's actually one of our best-selling spectacles in the military and tactical markets. That's a single lens with a wraparound. It has a really high level of protection in terms of the amount of your face it's going to protect. And also, if you have a laser beam coming really from the side, you're going to get that full protection. So think of the Stinger Hawk spectacle as really the maximum amount of protection that you can get. The SF2 frame is interesting because it's actually an approved frame. It's a metal frame. It's got a bit more of a style to it. And that's really what makes it different is it's technically the Joint Strike Fighter frame that's used in a lot of different applications in the Air Force, where we've worked with the company that manufactures that frame to implement our lenses into it for this application.
And do you recommend one model for helicopters and one model for fixed wing, or could either use either type?
We tend to recommend that you use the Stinger Hawk frame if you're in a helicopter and you're using the SF2 frame if you are in an airplane cockpit. However, some of it does come into personal preference and style, so I could see folks gravitating to one over the other. They're going to offer the same level of laser protection, which is critical.
That was my next question. So we get the same level of protection, but we have kind of better coverage around the side with the Stinger Hawk, and we've got the, what can I say, the cooler look for someone who cares about how they look at night in the cockpit.
Yes, absolutely. The other thing that the SF2 frame has is it has a little bit of an anti-reflective coating on it, which does perform a bit more in that airplane cockpit environment.
What kind of feedback have you gotten from people in the field who've used these eyewear?
You know, one of the advantages of working with Air Force Research Lab and development of the product is they did identify specific pilot end users to help along the development process to validate it. And it was, in this case, it was the Washington State Police Patrol who did do the trial and evaluation during the development of the product. And what they were able to see was that it performed a lot better than any of the other laser protective eyewear that they had tried out because it was tuned for the cockpit environment. The SF2 frame was definitely offered a comfortable, easy to put on product. So it really integrates well with if you're utilizing any headsets. And ultimately, this type of protection is all about the peace of mind and the confidence that it gives you, right? So while it is designed to perform to protect you from true eye injuries, we've also heard that just the peace of mind and the calm of you put it on and you know that even if you experience a laser threat, you're not going to experience the distraction, the potential eye injury, and you can just do the job you need to without considering what that threat might be.
Boy, I like peace of mind, certainly when I'm flying. I like to have eliminated as many of the possible threats as possible so I can just focus on the job at hand. And I can see that wearing something like this would make people just more relaxed, knowing that they will be protected to some extent if they get hit by a laser.
One other thing I will add is we recognize that a lot of pilots also wear corrective eyewear. So this is another situation that's really important, is that both the Stinger Hawk and SF2 frames offer a vision correction carrier. They're a little different how both of them perform, but fundamentally you can get your prescription filled in that carrier so it snaps into the eyewear so you are able to have your vision correction with the laser protection and you're not sacrificing on that or having to put the eyewear over your glasses.
Tell us about the pricing on the two different models if someone's listening and is interested in buying a pair for themselves.
So currently, the MSRP on the Stinger Hawk version is $199.99, and then the MSRP on the SF2 is $499.99. So there is a little bit of a price difference between the two solutions as well. I will say that currently we are speaking to everybody who's interested in purchasing this directly. So it's not something you can just go to our website and buy. There are additional pricing levels for individuals in certain markets or also in terms of quantity. So I would say that we're looking to talk to anyone who's interested in it and find a solution for them at the price point.
As we start to wrap up, what kind of final thoughts do you have that pilots should really be thinking about when they think about lasers and flying?
So I think one of the things we've learned over the years is there is not a one-size-fits-all solutions for every single laser you can encounter. This is a situation where you need to be educated or you need to talk to folks like Revision who are really educated on the threat and what the solution might need to be. So if you Google laser eye protection, there's going to be a lot of different solutions that come up. Some of them are designed for more of a medical use, or some are designed for a military use. So understanding what your threat is and finding eyewear that is made for your environment is a critical part of ensuring you're getting the protection that you need.
Got it. Now, where would people go to find out more information about your eyewear?
If you go to revisionmilitary.com, you're going to find information on the Cali solution there, and then how to reach out to us if you have any questions or you're interested in purchasing.
Kelly, looks like a great product. Thanks so much for joining us here today.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
And my thanks to Kelly for taking the time to talk with us today. After we talked, she asked me if we'd like to have a discount code for Aviation News Talk listeners who buy the laser protection eyewear she talked about. And so I said, of course. Here are the details. To order either of the protective eyewear products discussed, you need to send either an email to sales@revisionmilitary.com, or you need to call them by phone and place an order at 802-879-7002. Now, that's a Vermont area code where they're located, and they're offering a 15% discount to listeners if you use the discount code Aviation News Talk. Now, I was alerted to this new product by a description on another aviation media website, and in it they described it as being sunglasses. In fact, they used the term 4 times. I asked Kelly if these are sunglasses, and she said no, these are for use at night. They are laser protection eyewear, though she did say that they might provide some protection from ultraviolet radiation. Well, coming up next, your feedback and questions, all right here on the Aviation News Talk podcast. And let's start off with some good news. First, congratulations to Patreon mega supporter Troy Bainbridge. He says he's completed his helicopter add-on rating. He says he plans to add commercial and CFI for helicopter as well. So congratulations, Troy. And I saw a post from Dr. Scott Denstedt, who we've had on the show several times. He said, I've started something I've been wanting to do for over 15 years. I'm now broadcasting a morning daily weather overview for GA pilots. You can tune in every weekday morning at 7 a.m. Eastern Time on YouTube Live to watch this broadcast. The goal is to highlight the challenging weather across the U.S. and southern Canada for that day. Each broadcast will last about 10 minutes and will be posted to EZWX Brief YouTube channel shortly thereafter. So just go out to youtube.com and look for AVWX workshops to find that. Now, I noticed that he posted something on Saturday which said it looks like a rough day in Southern California. He says the EDR values, which would be the eddy dissipation rate, are supposed to be near 44 in the Palm Springs area later that day in the mid and upper flight levels. Now that, of course, is going to lead to some fairly severe turbulence. In fact, I saw he posted one PIREP from Saturday morning, which was over the LA area, and it was from a Pilatus PC-12 at 8,000 feet. It reported severe turbulence, and in the comments, it said, barely hanging on. So I guess somebody has a good sense of humor, even in the midst of a tough situation. My favorite PIREP was from years ago, in which a pilot reported moderate turbulence, and then in the comments, he said, wife says it's severe. So I guess that makes it severe turbulence. Let's go to some of your emails. Here's a message from PayPal supporter Doug Fortnum. He says, hi, Max. I'm a CFII in New Hampshire. Love your books and podcast. I often refer my clients to your podcast for topic-specific information. Was lucky to win a local raffle for a half-hour flight in a Vision Jet. I can see why you like it so much, Doug. Well, Doug, I am headed off on Sunday this weekend for another 2-day trip. In fact, I might actually postpone the start of it a little bit because of the turbulence that I mentioned. So a couple more days of teaching in the Vision Jet, which should be great fun. So I'm glad you enjoyed your flight. Here's a message from Bill Crahan. He's a Patreon supporter. He says he's been a listener since the first episode. He says, I just finished listening to the episode where you interviewed George Brawley, which would be episode 222. Wow, what an amazing person he is. And all of us aviators will owe him a huge debt of gratitude. Thank you so much for all you do as well for this community. Your content is so valuable. Thank you, Bill. And here's a message from Patreon supporter Steve Bloom. He says, hey, Max, quick note to say thanks for episode 222. I almost skipped it because I thought it might get too deep for my little pilot brain, but I trusted you to keep it interesting, and it was fantastic. Great interview, great info, and really exciting to have a better fuel on the horizon. Thanks for that, Steve. And I had emails come in from 3 different people with follow-up questions for George Brawley. I sent them to him, but I haven't heard answers yet back. But when I do, we'll read them on the show. And here's another one related to that episode. This came from Jan Bemelmans. He's in Deutschland. He says, I just finished listening to episode 222 and found the interview with George Brawley very interesting. At my aero club, all but one airplane, a Piper PA-28, are using unleaded fuel. He says 2 have STC'd Lycoming-powered Cessnas and 4 have Rotax-powered engines. Aside from the environmental effect, this is especially important because at my home airport, Echo Delta Foxtrot Victor in southwestern Germany, 1 liter of avgas, 100 low lead, sells for 2.62 euros, which at the moment is about $11 per gallon. The Aero Club and pilots save about 30% by using automotive fuel, which is still $7.80 per U.S. gallon. He says, recently I was reading an article about sleepwalking to 100 UL on AvWeb and was surprised to learn that a Swedish company, Helmco, which is spelled Hjelmco, Helmco has invented unleaded avgas more than 30 years ago. Their fuel is STC'd for smaller engines up to 180 horsepower. I wonder why it's not used outside of Sweden. Maybe an interview with their founder, Lars Hjelmberg, would be a nice follow-up. Considering his comments to the article, he seems to have experienced some headwind in getting to the markets outside of Sweden. Looking forward to the following episodes. Keep up the great work. Viele Grüße aus Deutschland. From Jan. And I went to that article on AvWeb, and I noticed that the inventor of the fuel that he's mentioning made a comment on that article, and it's a comment from Lars Hjelmberg. He says, it's interesting to learn that credit is given to several U.S. companies about unleaded avgas. The truth is that Helmco Oil in Sweden, already 40 years ago, introduced unleaded grade 80 avgas with nationwide distribution, and this fuel was also used by the Swedish Air Force. In years 1991, i.e. 30 years ago, Helmco introduced grade 91/96 UL, which the same year was approved by the Swedish Civil Aviation Authority. The grade UL 94 circulating in the U.S. is an attempt to copy the successful avgas Helmco 91/96 UL, which today is the most used avgas in Sweden. Already in the year of 2006, yes, more than 15 years ago, Helmco introduced the unleaded fuel 100 UL, which at the same time was tested and evaluated by none other than the European Civil Aviation Authority. In order to get this fuel certified, Helmco spent 10 years in the ASTM to get the active component certified to be included in an aviation gasoline meeting ASTM standards. This component now has a current U.S. standard. In the December 2021 unleaded avgas meeting with the industry arranged by the FAA, Helmco Oil was banned by the FAA to participate in spite of a formal written request from Helmco. The 100 UL avgas invented by Helmco, Lars Hjelmberg, carries several fresh U.S. patents as well as patents in Canada and many more countries in the world. The patents are also owned by major world-leading international avgas oil companies. You can Google yourself to see them. It's interesting to see how incomplete information to the U.S. public can be, and sadly, the potential censorship question mark that is evidently existing. Well, that was an interesting comment. And here's an email that came from Sarah in Maine. She writes, Max, as you are always emphasizing safety and often cite reckless behavior by pilots involved in incidents, arrests, etc., I thought of you. She says, I love reading about daredevils and rule breakers, and I'm in awe of such individuals because a daredevil I am not. But when I was researching some additional biographical information online, she mentions a particular pilot, and learned more about the incidents behind his reputation, it struck me that it seemed rather hypocritical that he was inducted posthumously into the National Aviation Hall of Fame, because essentially the message is that the hazardous attitudes that I was tested on during my checkride oral and am repeatedly admonished to avoid in or report if witnessed become celebrated if enough time goes by. And I would also add, and if the person survives. The pilot's behavior reminds me of a pilot I know in my area who was the worst example for me when I was a fledgling pilot, but thankfully I was old and wise enough to follow my own path in aviation, a path which respects rules out of concern for preventing accidents and harm to other human beings, rather than thinking rules don't apply to me. I realize that rule breakers have played a large part over the years in aviation innovation and all fields, but Anyway, thanks for listening, and thanks for giving me the best thing to listen to for keeping up with the aviation world while I make dinner. I really love this podcast so much. As a low-hour private pilot who lives in a state, Maine, with winters that render proficiency maintenance a bit of a challenge, I consider this podcast a supplement to staying on top of my game when grounded by extended bad weather. Well, thanks so much, Sarah, and stay warm up there. And here's an email from Patreon supporter Sal Sadati. It says, "Hi, Max. Enjoyed episode 220 this evening. As always, you and your guest are very informative, and there's always something new to learn. This brings me to my comment. I own a Cessna 152. In the next few weeks, my mechanic will be adding vortex generators, also known as VGs, and a JPI engine monitor, and some high-intensity wingtip lights to make it the most expensive 152 out there. My question is, what do I do differently when flying, if anything, with the VGs installed? I've read that I might be flying slower, and engine might be slower to respond during a go-around, which could pose some problems." No, I don't think your engine's going to be slower to respond with VGs. I'll talk more about that in a moment. And he continues, "I don't know yet if the engine monitor comes with a user manual telling me what's normal or abnormal, things like oil pressure and temperature of various components. What might be a good resource for this? I read articles and a webinar from Savvy Aviation's Mike Bush. Maybe he would be a good guest to have on the show, and guess what? We've had him on at least twice, maybe 3 times. He says the wingtip lights are pretty simple, thankfully. Any thoughts on the other items? That Cessna is becoming pretty expensive. Just about everything is new, and it sure is pretty. Looking forward to hearing from you. Thanks." Well, first, congratulations on all the upgrades to your Cessna 152. I had VGs on the Lake Amphibian, a Buccaneer that I used to have, so I'm somewhat familiar with them. They occasionally fall off, and my recollection is that the aircraft becomes unairworthy after some small number of them, perhaps 2, are missing. So when you lose your first one, get a replacement kit. And to get the kit, I think you need to show some documentation, such as the STC for your plane, so hang on to all the documentation. I thought that VGs would give my plane a lower stall speed, but if it was slower, it was undocumented. I read that the main benefit of having them was that you'd get better aileron control at slow speeds. Now, that's essential for a seaplane, as sometimes a wave will eject us out of the water at stall speed, and we need all of the controllability we can get at those slow speeds. I'm guessing you'll also get better controllability, but you may only notice it just before touchdown when you're really slow. Now, I've had Mike Bush on at least twice. We're good friends, as we both got our national awards in 2008 and met at EAA AirVenture during the awards presentation. I had a JPI 800 in the Cessna T210 that I owned about 20 years ago. It will include documentation on how to operate the JPI, but it might not give you temperature limits, though it will tell you how to set limits so that the display flashes when you read them. Most literature I've seen suggests keeping CHTs below 400 degrees, and some actually say 380. Usually, you'll only reach those numbers in a climb on a hot day, though if you forget to richen the mixture fully, it could happen any time. So you may want to set your JPI for 380 or 400 degrees. If it reaches that number, check to make sure the mixture is full rich, and reduce your climb rate. In other words, climb at a higher airspeed with a lower vertical speed to increase the airflow and cooling through the engine. Hope that helps, and thank you so much for your Patreon support. And here's an email from Aaron in Northern California. He says, "Hi, Max. I had an in-flight emergency this morning in my 1967 Piper Cherokee 180 that I thought might interest you. I had just made one of my better landings earlier this morning from the Weed Airport, that's Oscar 46, and was feeling good, so I decided to take off again for the nearby Siskiyou Airport, where my instructor has also signed me off to solo. Long story short, though I didn't immediately know what was happening, one of my prop blades suffered a delamination along the leading edge shortly after takeoff. There was a thump followed by some vibrations from the engine. When it happened, I was about 1,500 feet above the runway elevation, which I normally wouldn't consider to be enough altitude for a turn back to the runway in a loss of power emergency. Even though the vibrations were very unnerving, there appeared to be no loss in power, and I was still climbing. I was briefly dumbfounded, and my brain forced me to stop and wind my watch. I scanned over the fuel selector, turning the fuel pump and landing lights on, checked the mixture, and made sure the prop was still full, checked all the gauges, and nothing seemed amiss, and I even pulled carb heat briefly to see if that would make the situation better. It was very cold that morning. After what seemed like an eternity, but which was probably only 30 seconds, I elected to turn back to the airport because I was only a few miles away, and again I still appeared to have full power. As I turned, I checked my immediate surroundings for landing zones in the event that I lost power, as the impossible turn was on my mind. After the turn and on the way back, I even throttled back slightly to keep the vibrations at a minimum. By the time I was back to the runway, I was at traffic pattern altitude, and I did a normal downwind base final in the direction of the far side of the runway rather than straight in. I could see that a straight-in approach would have required more aggressive maneuvering, which really didn't seem to be necessary since the airplane was flying just fine otherwise. Also, I have only practiced one power-off landing thus far in my training with my CFI, and I wasn't interested in trying one solo. I didn't make any distress calls because none of my radios were tuned to 121.5. He says, I landed and noted the delamination on the leading edge of one propeller blade, which confirmed my suspicions. I then also realized that the one single item I neglected in my pre-flight was to check the propeller for damage, and that if I had just used a checklist during my pre-flight, I might have noticed something on that propeller that could have possibly prevented me from being in the situation to begin with. I always use checklists once I'm inside the plane, but it hasn't been my habit to do it during the pre-flight inspection. At any rate, things went about as well as they could have, and this turned out to be a very educational experience for me. I attribute my reaction to the situation to good instruction from my CFI Troy Bainbridge, who we just mentioned earlier, as well as the fact that I listened to your podcast and have some prior experience in dealing with in-flight emergencies as a paraglider pilot. Curious to know your thoughts about the possibly impossible turn when you have full power, but you're unsure what the problem is and may lose it at any time. I can confirm the overwhelming urge to turn back immediately back to the runway. I can give more detail and photos of the prop if you're interested. Thanks again for the great podcast. Well, Aaron, there is an advisory circular from the FAA. It's AC 20-37E that talks about composite or wood delaminations. One of the things it mentions is the tap test, which you can use for delaminations and debonds in the blades if you have a composite propeller. Essentially, you tap the blade surface with a metal coin and listen for a hollow sound that indicates a possible dead area in the bonding. As for the impossible turn back to the airport, well, if you have full power as you did, then you should have no problem at all turning back to the airport. The impossible turn really refers to turning back to the airport after a loss of engine power when you're essentially a glider. Turning back to the airport in that situation can be more dangerous than just landing somewhere straight ahead. But if you have full power like you did, then turning back to the airport should be relatively easy. And here's an email from Tom in Southern California. He says, I recently discovered your podcast and have really been enjoying it. I have a question for you about flight training. I'm a 50-year-old aspiring pilot. I took flight lessons in 2003 and actually soloed and have about 50 hours. I want to restart my training, but I'm not sure when I'll be able to start flight training again. I have a nervous wife and an 8-year-old, an 18-month-old at home, so I'm not sure when I'll be restarting. I've purchased the PHAC, which is the Pilot's Handbook of Aeronautical Knowledge, AFM, Aviation Weather, and FAR AIM, and plan to start reading and reviewing these. I hope to get my medical soon and then take the knowledge test. Do you have any other recommendations of what might be helpful to study, review so that I'm ready to fly again? Also, there are a couple of flight schools in my area. Some are Part 61, some are Part 141. What are your recommendations as to which is better? Additionally, one of the Part 61 schools uses the Diamond DA-40 for training. What's your take of these as a trainer? All my previous time was in 172s. My long-term goal is to get CFI and II rated and maybe teach part-time. I was also considering an accelerated program. What are your thoughts on these? And I think he means an accelerated program to get his private. Thanks for your time, and I look forward to getting caught up on the podcast. Well, Tom, you mentioned you don't know when you'll be restarting training, and I can say that flying is rarely anybody's top priority, so be patient, and eventually you'll be able to fit it in. In addition to the resources you mentioned, I would definitely recommend getting the FAA's Airplane Flying Handbook. You can find that for free on the FAA website, or you can also buy a printed copy for about $20. As for taking the written, I'd recommend that you don't do it more than a year before you plan to start flying again, because the test is only valid for 2 years. So if you wait a year, that would then give you 1 year to finish your training, though it shouldn't take that long since you already have 50 hours of experience. I think you get good training at either a Part 61 or a Part 141 school, so I wouldn't be too concerned about that. Frankly, I'd spend more time figuring out who you'd like to have as your flight instructor. So you might ask around for recommendations and then fly with a couple of CFIs to see who you like best. The Diamond DA-40 is a wonderful aircraft. I have several hundred hours in that, and I've taught a number of student pilots in it, so that aircraft should work fine for you. You said you're considering taking an accelerator program to complete your private. An accelerator program could work, but my observation is that pilots who take these programs, which are often offered in rural areas, come back inadequately trained to fly in the busy metropolitan areas, such as the ones that you and I live in. If you do decide to do that, then be prepared to spend a number of hours afterwards with a local CFI who can help fill in the gaps in your training so that you'll be safe to fly in your local area. Now, we had a lot of great emails, as you can see, from people who talked about how great episode 222 was last week. But we only had a couple of new people sign up as members to help support the podcast. Kind of funny, odd correlation. Maybe we'll get more people to sign up this week. Anyway, take a listen, see if you know the names of these people. And if you do, say hello to them and let them know that you heard their name on the show. We've got 2 new Patreon supporters, John Trowbridge at the $20 level, and actually the other one, Deb Gangwish, edited her pledge up to $20. We also had 3 one-time donations on PayPal, Doug Fortnum for $25, Keith Falarios for $50, and Carl Howd Insurance, $40. He said that's his payment for a 1-hour ground lesson rate for episode 196. He says he's an East Coaster, so mountain flying knowledge is not as culturally prevalent. Great content. Well, I'm glad you enjoy that. So my thanks to those new members, and also thanks to everyone who supports the show, whether it's by sending in your emails, by writing reviews on your podcast player, such as the Apple Podcast app, and those who support us financially. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.